What do you guys feel about see this little thing that came out? You're right.
Excuse me.
You're right, mate.
Yeah.
Did you guys see this thing that came out on Windrush Day, which was June the 22nd? Some MPs on the Conservative-dominated Commons Education Committee were looking into why poor white children underperform compared with other disadvantaged groups.
Funny thing for them to be focusing on.
And they rejected the government's view that poverty is solely to blame. This report claimed that there is an industry that has emerged to support disadvantaged non-white pupils. But at the same time, this is not available to white pupils themselves on things like free school meals, who underperform at every level of the education system from early years through to higher education. They then went on to say that terms such as white privilege, which is, as you guys know, white people benefiting from particular advantages in society, may have been one of the main reasons for systemic neglect of white disadvantaged communities. They accuse the government of muddled thinking and sweeping the problem under the carpet. Wow.
What's your take on this, Abiadi?
When I was poor, young, working class, and my parents came over from Nigeria in the early 80s, I was surrounded by poor white people. I was surrounded by poor Asian people. I was surrounded by poor African people. We were all united in our understanding, acknowledgement, and constant reminder that the government didn't give a fuck about any of us. That wasn't on racial lines. To speak about or to think about the UK isn't necessarily to talk about just a race problem. The class system here is completely fucked, and it always has been. And there is intersectionality there. There's overlapping there. But ultimately, many of the success stories you hear, especially with regards to this fact, which I think is now backed by statistics, that Asian, African, and to some extent Caribbean families excel in education and so on and so forth. That's got very little to do with anything that the government has laid out, very little to do with any red carpets that have come our way or any additional benefits. It's purely because in many of these countries, we have absolutely nothing else to rely upon except education. So that is embedded in us from early. There is literally no choice. So for them to turn around and basically say that there has been an industry that has supported people like me at the expense of Danny Driscoll, who I went to school with, or whoever it may be, who lived in Camberwell as well, who had the same sort of struggles as I did, is pretty fucking frustrating. For them to then go further and say that white privilege, the idea that white people do benefit from certain privileges that I do not, when I walk into a room, when I walk into a shopping mall, when I'm trying to apply for that job, when I'm trying to date someone's daughter, whatever it may be, for them to say that this is part of the reason why my fellow white counterparts aren't achieving or not doing anything is so offensive and so insane in its timing as well. I need to stress, this came out on Windrush Day, so a day where we're actually supposed to be commemorating
Coincidental timing.
Yeah, the people who came over to help build or rebuild post-war Britain. The timing was interesting for me, and it's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment. You've cut down Shore Start, you've closed down libraries, you've closed down youth centres, and all of this stuff that's come. We've got absolute evidence. It's all in black and white. Decades, generations of cuts. And now you're trying to cause essentially what is a race/culture war amongst everything below the middle class, mainly the working class, of course. Tommy, it pissed me off, as you could probably tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got two main points to make. The first one is that it puts paid to this culture war shite about black culture, specifically in the music space, grime, drill music, being a contributing factor to underperformance of black communities in social mobility, specifically in education, if all these supposedly racially, culturally inferior Africans and Caribbeans are listening to music that still makes their kids better at school than poor white kids. It's not an argument that holds much water any longer, and this report basically contradicts all the culture war shite that the Daily Mail have been putting out about rappers and footballers for the last 10 to 15 years. But more pertinently, I think it takes some fucking gumption for rich white MPs who voted for a white prime minister to slash the funding and availability of school meals to poor white children throughout holiday times, only to be saved by the campaign of a young black footballer. That gumption is not lost. That audacity is not lost. At the same time, not only do you campaign...
Was this a government report?
Yeah, this is the Education Committee.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's not a government report. It's an education.
It's the Education Committee, which is the Conservative-controlled Education Committee, right?
Not necessarily. I don't know who
the Education Committee is Conservative-controlled.
Okay.
Again, so 2 points I want to say. It puts pay to the point that grime and all these other supposedly black cultures are to do with black kids being violent and socially immobile if black kids are still supposedly advantaged in the education system. It also puts into scope the audacity of these MPs voting to make white kids hungrier and then seemingly blaming black people, even though it was a young black man by the name of Marcus Rashford who came through to actually ensure that the white kids in their own constituencies were fed a hot meal over Easter. But this is all classic conservative, classic right-wing culture war shtick. This is solid nationalist, solid right-wing propaganda that, rather than addressing the root cause of these structural inequalities, i.e., as Tommy and I have argued numerous times over housing and knife crime, are poverty, rather decides to create an enemy or an other from without, that being communities of color. And so the point that these people want to make isn't that white kids are poor because they're poor. It's that white kids are poor because black kids and brown kids have more things available to them than white kids do, which is even more bizarre in a country where seemingly people argue that there is an overrepresentation of black people on TV when 83% of the population is white.
Yeah.
So in a country where 83% of the population is white, why are white kids still poorer?
Yeah.
When you control
As I
the
said,
levers of power.
They said an industry has emerged to support
A cottage
disadvantaged,
industry, but
not white people's.
But anyway, I don't know. I like that the committee discounted the fact that poverty is the only factor. I think when you're talking about things like this, there's never one explanation, and usually for public consumption, we like to boil things down to nice, easy
Sound bites.
Nice, easy explanations. So it's poverty, or and it's going to be, like you said, Rich, earlier when you were explaining your own experiences. It's going to be a variety of things. It's going to be culture. It's going to be poverty. It's going to be backgrounds and all that kind of thing. I think I have a slightly different take on this. I haven't read this report, so I have no idea exactly what it says. I read the article. I kind of skim-read the article based around this. But I think you've seen this groundswell over the last 20, 25 years of a kind of poorer, working-class, kind of white community who has felt underrepresented, not represented when it comes to a kind of political level, like when it comes to a kind of a Westminster elite or whatever you may have, right?
Or they've just been used as political pawns.
Well, they haven't even been used, right? They just haven't been spoken to. They haven't been spoken to. They haven't been spoken about.
But they end up getting spoken to by the people who then decide to fuck them over the most.
Well, they get ignored for 10 years and then get told they're being ignored by people in power, even though they've been ignored by the people in power for 10 years, and they are in power.
And then they vote for those people and continue to be ignored.
Yeah, but it's a zero-sum game.
No, it's not the government. It's not the government. It's actually the black people.
But again, I don't think that's what this report said, right? So I think when it comes to this topic, this segment of the population, the working class whites, are relatively underrepresented because their needs, whatever they may be from a political perspective, aren't being spoken to. And that's what essentially UKIP votes 20 years ago were about.
GB News.
That's what Brexit's about. That's what GB News is about. That's what there, and it's not unfair. There is a segment of the population. Let me just pull a number out from my arse, basically, and say 15%, right? So, or 10%, or whatever it may be. There's a certain percentage of the electorate who, for a very long time, hasn't been spoken to. And when you haven't been spoken to, and you're frustrated, when your kids don't have good job opportunities or good education or whatever, you turn to more, let's say, extremist, I don't know, more
tendencies and
extremist
views.
Not even views, but more extremist options, right? More extremist parties or political, views or what have you. So I think this report is important. I think it's important to highlight that there's a segment of the population that's not doing as well as everyone else, whether white, black, Asian, whatever. And in this case, they're poor white people who for very many years haven't done particularly well when it comes to education and education outcomes. So for a report to come out and say, I highlighted this particular segment, which is underperforming. Similar segments have, all right, you can say that the term cottage industry is by design meant to inflame tensions or catch at headlines or whatever. But ultimately, the point that they're making is that similar, let's say, poor working class non-whites may have more opportunities, let's say, available to them. I reject. You're giving them
a lot of credit.
I reject the idea that this concept of what's the catchphrase that they say, white privilege, is having a negative impact, because the term white privilege and that kind of thinking is relatively new, whereas this issue is pretty old, right? And I think sometimes, given that we're all three guys from London, we're all three guys from London, I think sometimes it's easy to look at these things from a fairly London-centric perspective, where we have communities where, regardless of race, everyone's poor together.
I don't know.
Whereas
man.
if you go to the north, and some areas in the north, all the poor are white, basically, right? Here we have poor people who are black, brown, and white all living together, let's say. So for us, the issue is more poverty than it is maybe racial. Whereas if you're in Spatley and Ben or whatever, who the fuck cares, outside the M25, then you're going to think the issue's got to be more than just poverty. It could be also racial, because you're seeing fucking all these footballers taking the knee, and you're seeing Black Lives Matter and defund the police, and you're seeing attention on television and ads changing and mixed race families and this and that, and then you're hearing these fringe politicians on Facebook and things tell you that's what the issue is, blah blah blah, right?
But you're telling us what they are being fed with by politicians. What I'm speaking to is that if you go outside your fucking house, if you go outside of London, the reality couldn't be further from that. So you're giving the government or these people a lot of credit, given the fact that, as Johnny said, if it's 83% of this country is white, then it couldn't possibly, relatively speaking, be down to the fact that this small proportion of non-white pupils are getting the priority. That doesn't even make sense on just basic relative terms. But I don't think that's what the
report said, is it? I think the
basically
issue,
what it said.
I think the report was highlighting that this segment, the working class, so not just white, but specifically working class white people, have poorer educational outcomes than everyone else.
But going back to the point that you made about, and you are correct to say, obviously, that outside of London, poverty has a much more common skin complexion than it does. But that is exactly why this narrative and this rhetoric works, because there is a homogeneity of poverty. As you said, Rich, people in South London, East London grow up poor. White people, Latino Jews, grow up poor with black people. They grow up poor with Asian people, South Asian, East Asian. They grow up poor with Africans and Caribbeans. Everyone grows up poor. And there is a common understanding of cross-racial, interracial poverty that doesn't exist in areas where there is less immigration or fewer generations of immigrants. And so it is exactly in these areas that blaming the other is a powerful narrative.
100%.
And that is the pernicious angle of this report, into this industry of subverting white privilege, in that it is targeted at areas where there is a very high chance and a powerful cell in victimizing, well, not victimizing, in blaming the other, even though the other haven't been in power for the last 10 years. And in fact, the other have probably lost power and influence over the last 10 years. The other is people of color. The other is people of color, communities of color, this cottage industry of people who argue against, or in fact, it's not even that. Basically, what the report effectively says is there's more resource that goes into helping working class kids of color than there is resource that goes into helping white working class kids, and that's wrong. And you think, oh, well, okay, maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's wrong. In fact, fuck it. Let's take you at face value and say that that's wrong. But working class people of color are not the fucking government. You are the government, and you've been in power. You've been in charge of policy for 10 years. If anyone's responsible for white working class kids being ignored, it's you in government. It's not the charity and community organisers in Mile End. It's not the charity and community organisers in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Bradford, and all these areas that happen to cobble a bit of funding together for a youth club or a social centre outside the city centre. It's the government cutting funding to local communities, to removing youth centres, removing Sure Start, removing after-school clubs.
I'd say this is apolitical. It's not really a political issue because...
no, it's entirely political.
When I say a political issue, I mean a party politics, because whether it's been a Labour government or a Conservative government, it's historically... it's working class, whether it's white or non-white, it's the working class that typically get fucked, right? So I don't think it's a case of easily just saying it's a Conservative thing or it's a Labour thing. The reason these men started voting UKIP, the reason these men voted Brexit Party and Brexit itself and all the rest of it is because no one was speaking to them, both Conservative and Labour and Lib Dem and the political establishment as we see it, right? So... just to highlight that point is just to say that I don't think
because the UK
it's not a political party issue.
Could be because the UK is racist as well.
Yeah, it might be that. But to go back to Tommy's point,
you have no power. You never have any agency when you're poor. Basically, when you don't in a society like we live, and to the point that we started this, we all know ultimately money will drive better outcomes.
Right, but again, to go back to the overarching point, it's not. White working class kids aren't underperforming because communities of color are organizing to combat their poverty.
Yeah, no one here argued that.
Fine, but that's basically what the report is getting at, right?
Yeah.
And that's wrong, and that's evil, and the blurring of the lines between Blair Labour and Cameron conservatism is effectively a single ideology, regardless of which political color the party in charge represents. I think it's awful. And actually, this is the kind of thing. When people say that Britain is a racist country, it's the point that you made facetiously. When people say Britain is a racist country, it's not necessarily that everyone in the street calls you to the N-word when you're walking down the street. It's that a committee of parliament comes out with a report and says that communities of colour organising to combat their own poverty is the reason that white kids are poor. That is
or there's
why
no
Britain,
evidence of racism in the country, which was the report a month
right?
and a half.
So that these are examples.
I'm going to reread this report, because if the report does say that the reason, which I'm skeptical,
an
if
industry
it says
has been
the
built.
reason, yeah, but that's a different argument. If it says that the reason for these white kids, white working class poor children are underperforming or having worse educational outcomes is as a result of similarly poor non-white children getting more resources, then that's a kind of report that you can denounce and reject. But I don't think that's what it's saying.
Yeah, go read the report.
For real.